I love Jesus. Jesus loves me, this I know. I was raised in the faith, and Jesus was, I think, a personal friend to me. I think that's my testimony. That can happen.
At the height of his power, Robert Schuller seemed untouchable. A crystal cathedral, a worldwide audience, and a ministry worth millions. But some of the most dramatic collapses begin when nobody is paying attention. Behind the sermons and the success, tensions were building, decisions were made, relationships fractured. And in the span of just 3 years, one of the most recognizable figures in Christian television watched as the world he created began to unravel around him. A funeral he could not attend inside his own church. On the morning of April 20th, 2015, a black hearse pulled up to the front of a glass building in Garden Grove, California. Inside the closed casket was the body of Robert Harold Schuller, the man who once stood on that very stage and told 20 million people every Sunday that with God, all things are possible. He had died 18 days earlier in a nursing facility in Artesia, California, at the age of 88. His body had been hollowed out by esophageal cancer that had spread through his lymph nodes for nearly 2 years. The cathedral he built was no longer his. The board that voted to remove him 3 years before his death had already accepted a $57.5 million bid from the Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange. Construction workers were already inside, ripping out his pulpit, hanging 11,000 new panels, and dismantling the 17,000 pipes of the Hazelwright organ to be shipped to Italy for restoration. The service for Schuller was held inside the building, but the burial that followed could not be. He was laid to rest in the memorial gardens outside, in the same soil where he had walked when this property was nothing but an empty California lot. His wife of 63 years was already in that ground. Arvella Schuller had died on February 11, 2014, after producing every single episode of Hour of Power for more than 4 decades. She had testified in federal bankruptcy court before her death, and what she said in that courtroom would later haunt every word her husband ever preached. The mourners that day were not the celebrities and presidents Schuller had once entertained on his stage. They were a shrunken congregation, mostly elderly, mostly carrying the same grief Schuller himself had carried for the last 9 years of his life. They watched as his casket was lowered into the dirt of a property that no longer carried his name. And the story of how a man this powerful ended up beneath a Catholic cathedral is darker than anything the cameras of Hour of Power ever filmed. The day the glass belonged to strangers. The end did not arrive in a single moment. It arrived in stages, each one quieter and more humiliating than the last. The final Protestant service inside the Crystal Cathedral was held on June 30, 2013. The congregation that gathered that morning had been told for months that this would be the last time they would worship beneath the glass roof that Robert Schuller had spent his life raising. A week later, they packed their hymnals, their Bibles, and what was left of their dignity, and they relocated to a former Catholic parish a few miles away. They renamed themselves Shepherd's Grove. The change was not a rebrand, it was an eviction. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange had purchased the entire 34-acre campus for $57.5 million in a bankruptcy court sale that was approved on November 17, 2011. The presiding judge was Robert N. Kwan, and the decision he signed off on that day ended the most famous Protestant broadcast empire in American history. The diocese then spent close to $50 million more converting the building for Catholic Mass. They replaced Schuller's pulpit with a central altar. They installed a tabernacle. They added Stations of the Cross. They renamed the building Christ Cathedral. On July 17, 2019, the building was officially consecrated. Thousands of Catholics filed inside for the first official Mass, walking through the same glass doors where Schuller had once welcomed seekers with no judgment and no questions asked. The Hazelwright organ, dismantled and shipped to Padua in February 2014, did not return for nearly a decade. When it finally played again, in 2022, the music it produced filled a sanctuary that had been completely reimagined for a faith Schuller had never preached. You may wonder how a Protestant icon could end up beneath a Catholic cathedral by his own choice. The bidding war for the property had been fierce. Chapman University, a school affiliated with the Disciples of Christ, had offered $59 million, almost $2 million more than the diocese. Hobby Lobby had also placed a bid, but Schuller himself, still alive in 2011 and still influential, reportedly pushed the board toward the Catholic offer. He believed the Catholic Church would preserve the building for the worship of Jesus Christ for 2,000 more years. He may have been right, but the people he left behind still owed millions of dollars that they would never see paid. The founder who sued his own church and lost. If you have ever felt cheated by a powerful institution that promised you the world and delivered you nothing, then you already understand what hundreds of small business owners felt in the months after Crystal Cathedral Ministries filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on October 18, 2010. The filing listed more than $43 million in debt. $36 million of that was tied to a mortgage on the property Schuller had once dedicated completely debt-free. Buried inside those bankruptcy filings was a payroll list that shocked even the federal trustee assigned to the case. From 1993 to 2010, 4 members of the Schuller family alone had received nearly $13 million in compensation. At the time of the bankruptcy filing, roughly 20 family members were still drawing a combined $1.9 million a year. At least 8 insiders received tax-exempt housing allowances totaling $832,490 in a single year. Schuller's own son was pulling down nearly $196,500 annually. His son-in-law, Paul Dunn, had received over $300,000 in housing payments while living in Hawaii. Meanwhile, an animal supplier named Christina Oliver was losing her family home to foreclosure. Her company had provided the camels, horses, sheep, and donkeys for the Glory of Christmas pageant for 29 straight years. The ministry owed her $50,000 and never paid. She told reporters that she had truly believed the church was going to do the right thing, and that she now understood the only goal had been to string her along until she went away. The wardrobe manager, Juliet Noriega, was owed more than $11,000 for handling thousands of costume pieces on 200 performers. In 2011, Schuller's own daughter Sheila voted with the board to remove her father entirely. He was 84 years old. He had given 60 years of his life to that ministry. Robert and Arvella Schuller then filed for personal bankruptcy. Then Robert filed a $5 million claim against the church he founded, arguing that his sermons, his books, and his name were intellectual property the ministry had no right to use. The judge eventually awarded him about $600,000 and ruled that the church owned the rights to the Hour of Power broadcasts. The founder had sued the church and lost, and the family civil war was only just beginning to spill into public view. The house Schuller built and Schuller burned. You probably already know what a family looks like when it tears itself apart in private. The shouting, the silences, the dinners that nobody attends. The Schullers had all of that, but they also had television cameras, donors, and a board of directors watching every move they made. On January 22, 2006, at the age of 79, Robert Schuller installed his only son as senior pastor of the Crystal Cathedral. Robert A. Schuller was supposed to be the heir. The transition was supposed to be smooth. It lasted 2.5 years. In July of 2008, the board created a 3-person office of the president that quietly gutted the son's authority overnight. By October 25th, the father pulled the trigger. A statement was read announcing that father and son had different ideas about the direction of the ministry. and that this lack of shared vision had placed the entire ministry in jeopardy. The son resigned a month later. In a Christianity Today interview the following June, Robert A. Schuller was raw and direct about what had happened. He revealed that the ministry had been spending $4.5 million on a single hour of airtime each week, and that the board had simply decided to stop airing his messages. He called himself disappointed, sad, hurt, and angry. He said he believed God had dragged him out of the cathedral in order to send him somewhere else entirely. Years later, he would say something even more revealing in a public leadership conference. He told the audience that if his father had simply walked away when the time came, the ministry, the buildings, and the assets would all still be in family hands today. He said his father's mental capacities had been slipping noticeably since the year 2000. He said family-run ministries are wonderful, but only when they are placed under proper governance. And the Crystal Cathedral never had that protection in place. Sheila Schuller. Coleman took over leadership of the church in July 2010. 3 months later, the ministry filed for Chapter 11. By March 2012, Sheila herself walked out, telling reporters that her entire family was experiencing a hostile work environment. She went and started her own church called the Hope Center of Christ. 5 children had grown up on that stage. Every one of them eventually left. The empire they were abandoning had once been the brightest broadcast church on the planet, when 20 million people watched every Sunday. There was a time, not so long ago, when the Crystal Cathedral was the most visited and most watched church in America. To understand how far this family fell, you have to understand how high they once stood. The building itself was a marvel that nobody in 1980 believed possible. The architects were Philip Johnson and John Burgee, 2 of the most celebrated minds in modern American architecture. Johnson was openly skeptical of organized religion, but he agreed to design a sanctuary made entirely of glass for a man who told him he wanted worshippers to feel as though the sky itself was their roof. The result, dedicated on September 14, 1980, contained more than 10,000 panes of tempered silver glass. It seated over 2,200 people. It sat on a 34-acre property next to a 13-story Tower of Hope, topped by a 90-foot illuminated cross. Inside that sanctuary sat the Hazel Wright organ, named for a Chicago widow who gave $1 million to the project entirely unsolicited. The instrument held 17,106 pipes and was one of the largest pipe organs in the Western Hemisphere. The total cost of the cathedral was $18 million. Robert Schuller raised every single dollar before the doors opened. He sold individual window panes to donors for $500 each and inscribed their names on the glass. Not a single penny was borrowed. He told his congregation that a church built for God should never be built on borrowed money. Remember that promise. It is the same promise that would later be broken by his own family when they took out a $36 million mortgage on the same property. The Hour of Power broadcast had launched on KTLA in 1970 at the personal encouragement of Billy Graham. By the mid-1990s, it was reaching roughly 20 million viewers across 180 countries. It was the most watched televised church service on earth. The pageant tradition, Glory of Christmas and Glory of Easter, brought live camels, horses, sheep, and angels who flew up to 80 feet above the audience at 25 miles per hour. Tickets cost $45 and sold out for almost 30 straight years. Every Sunday, Schuller stood in flowing robes beneath that glass roof and told the world that any dream was possible. He had presidents on his stage. He had royalty in his pews. But underneath everything he built, his theology carried a single fatal flaw that almost nobody noticed at the time. The gospel that could not survive its own failure. If you have ever sat in a church and felt that something important was being quietly left out of the sermon, you may have stumbled into the same suspicion that haunted Robert Schuller's critics for 50 years. His message was warm. His message was encouraging. His message left people feeling lighter on the way out than they had felt on the way in. but his message had no place inside it for failure, for sin, or for repentance. Schuller called his philosophy possibility thinking. It was a Christian reworking of the message preached by his hero, Norman Vincent Peale, the author of The Power of Positive Thinking. Schuller once said that Peale had influenced his thinking and his theology and his life more than any other living person ever had. In 1982, Schuller published a book called Self-Esteem, The New Reformation. He mailed it free to thousands of pastors across the country. Inside that book, on page 14, he redefined the most ancient word in the entire Christian vocabulary. He wrote that sin is any act or thought that robs a human being of his or her self-esteem. He went further. He wrote that the core of sin is a lack of self-esteem and that a person is in hell when he has lost his self-esteem. John MacArthur preached against this view openly, reminding his own congregation that the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 3 had classified the love of self as a sin, not a solution. R.C. Sproul devoted an entire book to wrestling with where Schuller had gone wrong. Reformed theologians lined up to say that Schuller had not reformed Christianity at all. They argued that he had replaced it with something that looked like Christianity on the outside, but had no foundation underneath it. You may already see the problem. If sin is only the loss of self-esteem, then failure has no spiritual meaning. If failure has no meaning, then there is no framework for confession, no framework for repentance, and no framework for accountability. The ministry Schuller built had no theology for what to do when the money ran low, when the family fought, when the board turned cold. The cathedral had a soaring glass roof, but no spiritual ceiling for the storms beneath it. When the storms came, and they did come, the institution had no tools to handle them. The optimism that built the empire could not save the empire when failure finally arrived. And the children who inherited that empire had no spiritual language for the disaster unfolding inside their own home. From an Iowa farm to the last empty pew. Long before the glass, the bankruptcy, the lawsuits, and the cancer, there was just a boy on a farm in Alton, Iowa. Robert Harold Schuller was born on September 16, 1926, into a Dutch Reformed family that survived the Great Depression on potatoes, faith, and bent nails pulled from old fences. A tornado destroyed the family home when Robert was a college freshman, and he and his father rebuilt it together with whatever lumber they could pull from the wreckage. The lesson he carried out of that childhood was simple. Faith and optimism were the only two things in this life that could never be taken away from him. He graduated from Hope College in 1947, earned a Master of Divinity in 1950, married a church organist named Arvela de Haan that same year, and was ordained in the Reformed Church in America. In 1955, his denomination sent him to Garden Grove, California, with $500 and a promised salary of $4,000 a year. He had no congregation. He had no building. He rented the Orange Drive-In Theater for $10 a Sunday, climbed onto the tar-papered roof of the concession stand, and preached his first sermon to families sitting quietly inside their cars. He later said it was on that snack bar roof that he first fell in love with the sky. 60 years after that first sermon, the same man would be lowered into the dirt beneath a cathedral that no longer carried his name, mourned by a congregation that no longer carried his theology, in a service held inside a building that no longer belonged to his denomination. His grandson, Bobby Schuller, the son of the fired son, now continues a much smaller version of Hour of Power from a rented sanctuary in Irvine, California. The viewership is a tiny fraction of what it once was. The orchestra is gone. The pageants are gone. The flying angels are gone. What do you think really brought the Crystal Cathedral down? The money, the family, or the message itself? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and tell us which part of this story you cannot stop thinking about tonight.